The Society for Conservative Thought is the product of the current student movement to broaden the intellectual diversity of the college and establish an academic space where students can engage with the rich scholarly tradition of intellectual conservatism in the vein of Edmund Burke and Russell Kirk. As a nonpartisan and non-activist organization, we invite students of all varieties of political and social beliefs to expand their academic horizons and study, discuss, and even challenge ideas that are unfortunately so neglected in the Williams curriculum. The invitation of distinguished speakers to give voice to conservative principles on our campus is essential to the fulfillment of our mission, and I'm pleased to introduce one such speaker tonight. Dr. Chris Gibson has a long and distinguished record of public service to our nation. Over the course of 7 tours of duty with the U.S. Army, Dr. Gibson rose to the rank of colonel and was decorated with numerous awards, including 2 Legions of Merit, 4 Bronze Stars, and a Purple Heart. He earned a Master's of Public Affairs and PhD in Government from Cornell, and taught as a professor of American politics at West Point. He served several terms as a U.S. Congressman representing the 19th District of New York, and was recognized by the Bipartisan Index as being the 3rd most bipartisan member of the 114th U.S. Congress. Dr. Gibson has published 2 books, Securing the State, and also, most recently, Rally Point, 5 Tasks to Unite the Country and Revitalize the American Dream. So, without any further ado and further introduction, please welcome Williams College Stanley Kaplan Distinguished Visiting Professor of American Foreign Policy, Chris Gibson.
Well, good evening, everyone. John, thank you for the invitation and for the warm introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, great to be with you. I want to begin by commending Williams College. You turn on the news today, and oftentimes we hear about truncated conversations that are going on colleges, campuses, and universities. And I really commend Williams College for its commitment to academic excellence, its commitment to a full conversation, its commitment to the exploration of truth, wherever we may find it. And so, towards that end, I'm very excited to be with you tonight to talk about what does it mean to be a conservative. Now, of course, renowned political scientist Clinton Rossiter, who wrote a book called Conservatism in America, made the point, and I wouldn't want to dismiss it. In fact, I think there's a lot of value to what he says, that there isn't one definition of conservative. In fact, he goes on to explain that there are many different brands or variants of conservatism, beyond sort of the topical, whether somebody is a libertarian, a social conservative, or might they be, as Rossiter pointed out, temperamentally disposed towards conservatism, or sort of a pragmatic approach to problem solving. Be that as it may. What I want to do tonight, rather polemically perhaps, is make an argument for what we should view conservatism, with all acknowledgement of diversity of thought within the field of conservatism. Now, my argument is going to rest largely on language, actually. I think it's important to ask, when you say, what does it mean to be a conservative, it's fair to say, what are we trying to conserve? I think that's an operative question to me. And to me, I answer that with a very healthy respect for a view of history, that what I think we should be conserving are founding principles. We have a tendency to really look back and say, well, of course. Or as a former infantryman, for us, when we would serve, we would have callus, a very significant callus, quite frankly, on our feet. It was functional. It allowed us to walk 20 miles with a heavy pack, do a live fire exercise at the conclusion of that. But when you actually think further about what a callus is and the function of it, essentially, it allows you not to feel what a callus really does. It allows you to function, you don't feel that pain. And I think that's a problem for us as humans in general. In this case too, but in general, is that we have a tendency, once we achieve something or reach something, we tend not to view it in the same way we viewed it when we were striving for it. And I think that's part of the challenge with founding principles, is we tend to take them for granted. And I would tell you that for our country, we really changed the course of human history and what we did in the late 18th century. In fact, in many respects, we escaped history, because the history of political change before us was violent. Think about it. You had regimes, mostly totalitarian, authoritarian of some kind, generally a monarchy, right, with an aristocracy supporting. And they held power for a period of time. They may have atrophied, weakened, and then they were toppled, usually with some kind of regicide, and long live the new king or queen, right? I mean, that was really the nature of political change. And our founders said, it doesn't have to be like that. We can actually debate issues. We can come to our own conclusions on those issues, and we can affect peaceful evolutionary change. And, the heads of state of Europe, they gave us no chance. They said, this will never work. In fact, they scoffed at us. And when I used to explain this to my constituents, they would actually think that's incredulous. They say, really? They really didn't think we would fail. Like, no, they really thought we would fail. And if you think about it, they batted 1 for 2, right? I mean, those kind of numbers you'd be in Cooperstown. You'd be in the Hall of Fame, Baseball Hall of Fame. Because our contemporary, the French Revolution, arguably more loftier aspirations than even our own, ultimately, after years of instability, ultimately then asking Robespierre to come forward, then you figure it out since you're not happy with anything that's going on, and that reign of terror ultimately led the French people to just beg for the monarchy to come back in the form of Napoleon, the emperor. And yet, our revolution lasts. I think it's worthwhile to look at this when we talk about what it means to be a conservative and what are we conserving. So let me then let me talk about this. And the way that I describe is really the spirit of Philadelphia. The spirit of Philadelphia, first enunciated with Thomas Jefferson's lead in the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Those were radical words for the time. The idea that we can govern ourselves, I just went through that, there's no way they thought that could happen. But this idea that there were natural rights that existed among humanity, and that government's responsibility was to secure those rights, this was bringing forward the concept of citizen. We were going to move beyond subject, and we were going to embrace this concept of citizen. Now, today, and really largely throughout history, whenever we've talked about citizens, the first thing we've always talked about is rights. I talked about rights. They're so important to me too. That's half the story. And we accepted the role of citizen. We accepted rights and responsibilities. This is part of the spirit of Philadelphia. That sovereignty resides in you, King. It resides in all of us. That's where sovereignty resides. And that we will have a Republican form of government where we choose, by election, our representatives, and they shall be our voice. This isn't the ideal. I know there's a lot of disaffection today, and that's part of what we'll probably talk about. But I want to say that this is really the first moment of real hope for humanity, when we come forward with this spirit of Philadelphia. Now, we were challenged. There was very seldom in the course of history do you see such a radical set of ideas just happen, and we had to fight for them. We had to fight for our liberties, and we did prevail. And we had liberty. And we had chaos. We had chaos. I mean, we had states that were coining money. We had states that were entering into potential treaty obligations with other nations. And we had domestic intranquility. We had situations where we had farmers who had fought very bravely for us. In fact, in this state here, not far from here, and Shays, Kaplan, led formations, and they moved to close on his farm. And they said, you're not paying your taxes, we're going to close on your farm. And he says, I'm holding script. You gave me these continental dollars, it's not worth anything. And how tragically ironic would it have been that a nation that was founded largely as a tax revolt could end up in a situation where we're oppressing our people like this. Our leading statesmen and women, they knew that that was never going to work. They had to find a way to overcome this. They tried. They tried to amend the articles several times. In fact, as late as 1786 in Annapolis. And every time they tried to amend it, it wouldn't work. They couldn't get a consensus going. And so over the winter of 86, 87, they sent invitations out to meet in Philadelphia. This is where the spirit of Philadelphia is refined. Now, When they came in, one of the first things they did was lock the door. They said, well, we're not going to talk to the media. And they, what? Now keep in mind, their charter was to amend the articles. They had no authority to do more than that. But the leaders then said, if this is going to survive, we're going to have to find a way to balance liberty and security. This is the broader subject. This is the broader question. Now, of course, it delved into all these respective arguments that follow, the separation of powers and all that's going to follow from there. But really, this was about allowing for the thriving of liberty with a sense of order or security. And so we bring forward the Constitution of the United States. Certainly controversial. Now, we don't look at it that way, right? It's mostly venerated. When we talk in many places, not in all, but in many places, it's venerated. In fact, when I would meet with the Tea Party, I would meet with everybody as a representative. I'd meet with Tea Party, MoveOn.org, and everybody in between. But it used to be very curious to me because the Tea Party would be going crazy. We love the Constitution. I said, how about Patrick Henry? We love Patrick Henry. And I said, and he loved the Constitution. And they'd say, yes. I'd say, wrong. Actually, the biggest critic. He actually tried to defeat the Constitution. He viewed it as a big power grab. But this was really important, I think, when we talk about what it means to be conservative. There was a recognition that there was a role for government. I used to bring this up to my colleagues down in Congress. We're not for no government. We've settled that. They go, yeah, that's right, Gingrich in '95. No, long before that, we made a decision that we wanted liberty and we wanted limited and effective government. And this is what we did when we ratified that Constitution, because we had a choice. We didn't have to. We could have rejected it. We could have stuck with the articles. And yet, our delegates brought forward that Constitution. Separation of powers, the federalism that undergirded it, because, Madison, very curious, he said we're going to have checks for checks for checks. And then ultimately that Bill of Rights. Bill of Rights so critically important, and again, an incredible moment for the history of mankind. And quite frankly, a face-saving mechanism for some states, like my state, New York. Because when our state voted for delegates, they only voted for the delegates who were going to vote the darn thing down. And so by the time 11 states had voted for it, New York is like, now what do we do? The people are counting on us to vote no. And if we vote no, we're outside the union. We're going to be outside this thing by ourselves. And so that, well, you're going to have to include this Bill of Rights, or by gosh, we're going to vote no. And of course, Virginia made the same play, and this was all to the good anyways. And we get the Bill of Rights. I think an important thing to recognize with the Constitution is that the Constitution itself was a compromise. This was very important for me to go and allow myself to be questioned by any Tea Party member. Because sometimes they would yell to me when I first went to Congress, no compromise. You heard the record. That I stood as, I was proud of that statesman ranking. Actually, number 1 in the country in the 113th Congress, and number 3 in the 114th Congress, and there was a reason for it. It was a bill that I did was explicitly only for Republicans, and if you want to ask me in the Q&A, I'll tell you what it is. But here's the point. The Constitution itself was a compromise, and it was meant to drive compromise. That was the whole point. Is that, we not only had this, you had the Virginia plan, you had the New Jersey plan, and that was a big state, small state thing, and then you had the Connecticut Compromise. But the whole point was that the document itself would allow for us to work together and find accommodation. And I think this is critically important to understanding the spirit of Philadelphia. Because I'm going to get to in a moment, part of the reason why we're so torn apart is because we don't do significant political change like that anymore. We are a nation of laws, but increasingly we don't do significant political change via the rule of law. I'll talk about that in a second. Let me lay out the third piece of the spirit of Philadelphia. And it actually comes again from language. Philadelphia itself, the city of brotherly love, right? And the point is this, is that in addition to the constitutional framework, the legal array that was to provide for our liberty, but also to provide for peaceful evolutionary change, that was augmented by a hybrid, unique, never seen before political culture here. And they went in tandem. It wasn't just a legal arrangement, it was also the political culture. This is critically important, I think, and sometimes overlooked. Oftentimes when you read historians, and sometimes it's actually very interesting to look at some of their takes on it, but you'll hear about the Lockean, the Enlightenment influence. It's undeniable. I mean, it's right there. We had Montesquieu, we had Spirit of Laws open right there when we were in Philadelphia the second time. And we were looking towards understanding how to parade this separation of powers. And, you know, so many of our leading states people at the time, and they had been studying this. And they had read Locke. They had read so many others of the Enlightenment. But our culture actually at the same time was heavily influenced by Rousseau, even though Rousseau was only a couple decades older. And, if we're being intellectually honest with ourselves, Rousseau was sitting upon almost 200 years of influence from Winthrop, Cotton Mather. So, I mean, if we're being intellectually honest, it's not necessarily politically correct to talk about that, but here's my point to you, is we, at the same time that we believed in the pursuit of happiness, arguably the most radical of the natural rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, you say that in the 21st century, and people say, isn't that like fleshy? Isn't that corporeal? Isn't that ephemeral? That is not what the founders intended. When they talked about the pursuit of happiness, that had to do from the Greek word eudaimonia, which was a flourishing life. You know, before us, you were born to serve, and you died to serve. That was the way it was. Our founders said, no, you have a natural right to your own potential. Every one of you have a natural right to your own potential. And that was remarkable that we put that on paper. By the way, if you're wondering, how can this guy stand here in the 21st century still talking about this, it's not lost on anyone, I would hope, that when Dr. Martin Luther King went to Washington, he invoked these very same things. He said, in fact, I'm here to cash a check. I'm here to cash a check. I refuse to believe that this incredibly wealthy nation would have insufficient funds in the Bank of Justice. I'm here to see that every single soul will have an opportunity to rise to their God-given potential, the pursuit of happiness. But the pursuit of happiness in the early years was balanced with a deep sense of obligation. Obligation to each other. Yes, Rousseau, he talked about this. The fact of the matter is he was rebelling a little bit against the radical empiricism of the day. The idea that we can have an equation for everything. We can solve everything with science. You know, and he said, well, where's the equation for love? Where do I find out who it is I'm going to love? Where do I find out what it is that I'm passionate about? Well, you won't find it. This is Rousseau, this was his point, is we're much more complex. We are human. We have a soul. And in that soul, we know that we have obligations to each other. We support each other. So when you put these two together, this pursuit of happiness with a deep sense of obligation, I didn't say it had to be in the federal government. I didn't say it even had to be in the state government. But it most certainly was in our individual lives. And this is what de Tocqueville talked about when he came here. You know, ostensibly to study prisons, right? But he was really sent here to figure out why is it that this country, number two, hasn't begged for the monarchy yet. And after spending about 10 months here and traveling pretty widely, the second time we've been over here, he went back and he told the heads of state of Europe, he says, I got news for you, they're never going to beg for you to come back. In fact, they're going to go on to be a leading superpower in the world. And one of the reasons why he explained was what I just read to you. This legal framework in this sense, this political culture that kept the fabric together. The spirit of Philadelphia. So when we say, what does it mean to be a conservative? I'm passionate about conserving those principles. Where are we today? Well, part of the reason why arguably we've never been more divided since the Civil War, which is an interesting case we could talk about if you want in the Q&A. But even I would argue, although I was a lad then at the time, more than the Vietnam War, arguably more divided. $20 trillion in debt. And whether you went to a Trump rally or a Bernie Sanders rally, there was a deep feeling that our system is rigged, politically and economically. You know, and I'm as patriotic as you're going to find, growing up not far from here and served this country for 29 years in uniform. But if you're going to press me and say, is the system rigged? I'm sad to tell you it is. It is rigged. And this is what's ironic, is that if you're a conservative today, you should be passionately for reform. For reform. Because we need to restore these founding principles. This is what this book is. So, I mean, when I met with my editor about this book in October, I was still in college at the time. He came and visited me. We were supposed to meet for 30 minutes. After 90 minutes, he looked at me and he said, Chris, it's right here. You need to let it out. Or you need to get a therapist. One or the other. I chose to write the book. Although I'm married to a therapist. It's really awesome. So, but, you know, here's my point to you. This book is a very passionate plea for us as Americans to rally around these founding principles. We have got to change the way we send representatives to Washington. I mean, this system is rigged for incumbents. It's rigged for moneyed interest. And it really, when I throw out this stat to you, the fact of the matter is that over 95% of the political givings in the 2016 cycle, given by less than 200 people. Think of it, let that sink in for a second. It really calls into question the idea of one person, one vote. We're going to have to change the way we send. So I advocate in the book for term limits, for independent redistricting. I argue for campaign finance reform of the right kind, and for lobbying bans. All of this to restore faith in our ability to be self-governing. Because among all the things I've heard, the thing that alarmed me the most was, particularly in the last couple of years, people saying, well, we can't fix this anymore. There's no way that we can fix this. You know, we're basically heading towards a situation where we just have to hand this power over to an authoritarian and let that person fix it. I heard this from a very reasonable person who told me that, well, you know, we're just going to have to turn this all over to a strong person and let them decide. I'm telling you right now, if you believe in liberty and liberty's cousin, prosperity, that should concern you. That should really concern you. Because we can be self-governing, but it's going to require us to be for reform. So, you know, this is what this is about. Let me say one last thing before I go to Q&A, and that's this. We've also got to tackle the hard problems. I mean, we are $20 trillion in debt, and that's robbery on you guys. We cannot do business this way. I mean, if you think about if I was asked you to define the American dream, I would hope that you would say, first of all, that pursuit of happiness, that everyone has a God-given right to reach their potential. And the other piece has always been that we would set up the next generation for success. And yet, right now, my generation, I'm a Gen Xer, and the baby boomers, I mean, we run the risk of being the first generations to leave our children worse off condition than we inherited. And that's, so you can see why this is as much a moral imperative as it is an economic imperative. And so also in the book, I argue for how we got to get back to a balanced budget. We need real leadership to do it. Because right now, leaders in both parties, it's a one-upsmanship. It is. I'm the first Republican ever in my family, but you know what? All it is right now is everybody's promising you more. They're going to give you more. I mean, that's the whole thing. And at the end of the day, the books have got to balance. Whatever it is we decide after we debate, and we should debate spiritedly, but whatever it is that we decide, we should be paying for it. Because make no mistake about it, these deficits are just future taxes. They're your taxes. They're your taxes. If we're overspending, that's your tax. If we're not bringing in enough revenue, that's your tax. It's coming your way. And may you live 100 years. With the wonders of modern medicine, you may very well. And even beyond, possibly. And here you are now in your early 20s, maybe late teens. And you're looking at some very steep bills. Just to give some sense of perspective on this, on 30 September, the year just passed, our country, we paid $457 billion on nothing but interest. Nothing but interest. Think about the opportunity cost of that. Nothing but interest. Now, this was at a time when interest rates are really low. I mean, historically low. Now you see at the end of this phase of quantitative easing, it's probably going to tick back up again, particularly if we start to heat up a little bit. You know, you're going to see these interest rates rise, and, you know, forecasts right now on interest payments are they're going to go over $1 trillion in about 8 to 10 years. Just interest payments. We're going to have an annual deficit. Now keep in mind, again, I'm a Republican here, in unified Republican government, in 2020, we're going to have $1 trillion annual deficit. That is no good, ladies and gentlemen. We got to pay for what we consume. I'm passionate about this, and we can do this. And we can do it in, I would argue, a smart, conservative way to do it. So, you know, that's my message to you, is eyes wide open, is if we don't commit ourselves to reform, I see I see this, I mean, look, as I would tell folks, there's still a Rome. It's not like there's not a Rome. In fact, my family was there this summer. It's just not the Rome of 2,000 years ago. We don't have a birthright to this prosperity and freedom. Every generation has to renew the contract. And that's why it's so important, I think, that we embrace these founding principles going forward. That's enough, I think, to get you probably catalyzed to have a conversation. But I want to thank you for coming out tonight, and you know, I wish you, this is an incredible place, and you have a remarkable future ahead of you. I'm in 202 Shapiro. If I can help you in any way, please let me know. Stop in. And otherwise, God bless. Thanks.